Hi everyone, welcome back to the Lux Budget. My name is Emily and I am going to be talking to you today about understanding a wine label and tasting notes. I was in my Pilates class this morning and it just really struck me how confusing some of the jargon in the wine world can be. And I think that it's one of those things that prevents people from really feeling comfortable trying new things or asking questions. And so today I want to go over some of the confusing jargon words, specifically relating to old world wines and like the region that they come from. This video is for people who maybe know a little bit about wine, you know your way around a Cab or Sauvignon Blanc, but when you hear people start talking about Chablis or something being mineral driven with a touch of forest floor and you start getting confused and you're lost, this video is for you. So today's video the goal is to decode regional terms, translate some tasting notes, and help you confidently pick a bottle of wine that you know you're gonna like. So first off, I wanna talk about regions and how really when you're talking about, my mind always goes to French wine, but when you're talking about regions, what you're really talking about is grapes. So let's break down some of the old world regions and what the hell is actually happening in those bottles. So we're gonna start, as you could probably guess, with white Burgundy. So when I say white Burgundy, it's technically talking about a region in France. I believe it's to the west of France. But really when you're talking about white Burgundy, it's really referring to Chardonnay grapes because all of the white wines made in that region are Chardonnay. So then you might hear something like a Chablis, which is a sub-region inside of Burgundy that is still just a Chardonnay, but it's going to be lean, high acid, and not oaked at all. So it's going to be aged in stainless steel barrels primarily. But then you have something like a Marisol or a Pouligny, and it's going to be a richer wine. Again, those words, the Marisol and Pouligny, are referring to the sub-regions within Burgundy. They're going to be richer, they're going to be oaky, they're going to be more like a California Chardonnay where you start tasting butter and very oaky notes and things that are a little bit richer on the palate than just, being a little bit lighter and fruitier. Next is red Burgundy. So again, this is from the same region, but when you're talking about a red Burgundy, you're always talking about Pinot Noir grapes. Confusing, I know, but once you start thinking about things from the framework that old world wines are always going to be talking about the area that they're grown, because the area is going to have a lot more impact on the way that the wine is going to be grown, the way that it's going to be processed and matured and aged. And so there's a lot more commonality from that perspective based off of where the wine is coming from, more so than just what kind of grape it is. So then next we've got Bordeaux, which is usually going to be a blend. On the left bank, it's a little bit more Cabernet Sauvignon focused, versus the right bank is more Merlot focused. They're usually aged a little bit longer than your typical Burgundy is going to be. They're a lot more tannic, which means it gives it that really dry mouthfeel. They're going to be a little bit earthier. They're going to have less fruit forward, so you're not going to be smelling as many like cherries or raspberries. You're going to be smelling more, like a mossy feel or something that's making you think of like mushrooms or wood or something along those lines. A Chianti is really just Sangiovese grapes. Those are going to be medium-bodied, high acid, and savory. And again, Chianti is just an area in Italy where all of these grapes are grown. Rioja is in Spain, and those are always made from Tempranillo grapes. They're fruity or earthy depending on how long that they've been aged. And finally, we've got Alsace or German wines, which are typically going to be Rieslings. And I know we've talked about this before, but Rieslings are not always that cloyingly sweet, like almost Moscato-like wine. A lot of the time, it's going to be a little bit drier. So if you prefer something that's a little bit more dry, I would look for Trocken, which is the German word for dry, so that you can get something that's a little bit better for your own palate. So the TLDR for this is if it's from Europe, figure out the region, and then that's going to tell you more about the grape and style than just knowing, it's a Pinot Noir. This is where it just gets really interesting because there's so much history and culture that goes into the creation of these wines. And I think it's more confusing for people when you're starting off with wine, but once you know a little bit, you've gotten your toes wet, you really start to understand a lot more about the structure and the body of the wine based off of where it's grown, because there are standards that are common in those areas. Versus here, you get a Pinot Noir from Oregon versus California, and they're all going to be so wildly different. So that's one thing, is once you figure out those regions, you can get a better idea of what you like, and then there's a little bit more consistency. So then rather than worrying about the specific vineyard or the producer, you can worry about where it's coming from, and generally speaking, there's going to be a certain bar that those wines are going to have to reach in order to come from those areas. So section 2, I want to talk about tasting notes. I think this gets a little bit difficult for people because it sounds like there's a right answer and a wrong answer, but truthfully, wine tasting is so subjective. And so when people start talking about like raspberry on the nose, something tastes, oaky or minerally, there is usually some like common themes that you'll come up with certain wines. So like Sauvignon Blanc, a lot of the time you're going to get very citrusy on the nose. It's going to be very bright. It's going to be very light bodied. But there are times when that's not the case. And so there's no 100% correct way to describe it. There are a lot of people that say that newcomers to wine are a lot better at talking about wine because they're not so married to specific terms. So like people will say, the Sauvignon Blanc has like tennis ball, or it's got forest floor, or it's got whatever. And it's going to be more accurate a lot of the time because you're not so glued to a specific way of describing what something tastes like. So let's talk about fruity. When people say that, it doesn't mean that it's sweet. It means that there's obvious fruit. So there's like notes of blackberry or cherry or apple. Again, this does not mean sweet. This just means that you can smell things in it other than just grapes. When you hear the word jammy, that's going to be also technically like a different way of putting fruity, but it's for super, super ripe fruit, usually very low acid. You're typically going to see this in New World reds, and you're also going to see this in wines that are grown a little bit closer to the equator. And that's because they ripen a lot more, so they get a little bit more sugar in them, and they mature a little bit more before you get them in the bottle. And then finally, if you're talking about citrusy or tropical, that's talking about bright whites. It's usually just another way of saying that it's very acidic, which means it makes your mouth water, and it makes, think about like having a lemon and putting that on your mouth, on your tongue. It's going to make your mouth water, is essentially what acidic means. And then citrusy and tropical is just a way to describe that acidity. Other words that are more for structure is, again, acidic, crisp, bright. Those are all talking about the same thing. High acid, mouth-watering, food-friendly. If they're talking about tannic, grippy, or firm, the wine is going to be red, typically, with a drying texture, and it's usually going to be really good with meat and less fun by itself. Finally, if somebody says something like round or smooth or plush, it's talking about a wine that has very low tannin. So typically you would say something like this with a red wine, just because white wines typically don't have a ton of tannins. And it means that it's a soft texture. So it's not doing anything really specific to your palate. It's not making it water. It's not drying it out. It's round, it's soft. It's not aggressively doing anything to the inside of your mouth. And then just some other terms are oaky, toasty, buttery. Again, that's from oak aging. Think vanilla, smoke, baking spice, that kind of thing. Mineral, stony, chalky. It's usually for white wines, and it's clean and not fruity. So a good example of this is I'm going to talk about it maybe every video now, but the white Burgundy from De Montfamille Paquet. It's very mineral, so it's clean. It kind of has like a freshness to it, and there's no like real fruit to it. It's more leaning on that freshness, that cleanness, and it's almost like cold water going over like stones in a natural riverbed or something like that. So a good rule of thumb typically for New World wines, meaning the US, Chile, Argentina, New Zealand, Australia, so on, is that they typically will have more fruit language, whereas wines from the Old World, France, Italy, Spain, Germany, are going to be more centered on like earthy and structure language. Okay, so how do we put this into practice? So how do you read a wine label at the store? So if it's a New World bottle, again, the US, Australia, Chile, so on and so forth, think mostly just things outside of Europe. You're gonna look at the grape variety. So it's gonna say Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, so on and so forth. Look at the region, Sonoma versus Napa, because those are going to have very different styles. So unlike the Old World wines that are typically going to be referred to by region, and that's going to talk not only about the type of grapes that's used, but also the style in which it's produced. You kind of need to know a little bit about New World wines and the different regions, because a Sauvignon Blanc from Sonoma is going to be very different than a Sauvignon Blanc from Napa, because they have different styles of producing that particular type of wine. Usually a bottle of wine will also have tasting notes on the back of the label. And a good rule of thumb too is that higher alcohol percentage typically means it's going to be a bolder, jammier, richer wine. If it's an Old World bottle, so think France, Italy, Spain, you want to focus on that region name. You need to know what grape that means. So again, like a Sancerre is going to be Sauvignon Blanc, always. Or a white Burgundy is going to be Chardonnay, always. Know the producers. Typically, there's a lot of recognizable names out there that can signal quality. Now, again, being very famous and well-known does not necessarily mean that it's going to be a good wine, but as a rule of thumb, if they have a reputation for being a better producer, then it's going to typically be a better bottle of wine. And then another thing just to focus on for Old World bottles is the vintage, because younger years, so let's say like a 2023, it's going to be fresher, whereas an older one is going to be more complex, potentially a little bit more funky too. So it might have a lot more going on outside of just what you would expect from a 2022 Chardonnay from Sonoma. Red flags to watch out for. Reserve in the US really doesn't mean anything. So sometimes people will put that on wine labels just to make it seem a little bit more important than it really is. There's also a lot of just really generic words out there like smooth and bold, which usually is going to be an indicator that it's a mass-produced crop. So if it's not really talking more specifically about what you can expect from tasting this wine, high acid, fruit on the nose, minerality, whatever, if it's very generic, smooth, bold, it's typically because it's a larger crop, it's a larger production, and there's just not a ton that's distinguishing the wine itself from other types of wines that are available out there. Finally, a quick translator, if you like this, try that kind of deal. If you like a Napa Cabernet, think of like a left bank Bordeaux, because again, Bordeaux's are blends between Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon, and the left bank specifically leans a little bit heavier on the Cabernet side. It's the same grape, but in the Old World, it's just going to have more structure. It's typically going to be a little bit more interesting. There's a lot more history there, and that's helped inform the way that they are producing that wine. If you like a Pinot Noir from Oregon, a red Burgundy might be a really good option. Again, it's the same grape, but it's going to be a little bit more earthy than the Pinot Noir from Oregon. If you like a Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand, a Sancerre, like what I said before, from the Loire Valley, which is in France, same grape, but the Sancerre is going to be more mineral driven. One caution though, when it comes to Sancerre, is that because it's such a famous region, bottles are typically on the low end going to be around $45. And based off of the conversations that I've had with different sommeliers, starting out on the lower end, you're not going to see as much of a difference in a Sancerre compared to a good Sauvignon Blanc from somewhere else for less expensive. Where Sancerre starts to get really good is when you start spending more money on it. So think more in the like $60, $70, $80 bottle range. So a wine like that is typically going to be better served as a special occasion. If you like buttery Chardonnay, you want to try a Marisol, which is a white Burgundy that is aged in oak. And it's going to have that like buttery, vanilla-y, oaky taste to it. But it's just got a little bit more structure, more body than the Chardonnays that we're growing here in the US. Finally, if you like a dry Riesling, an Alsace Riesling, which is also in France, might be a good thing to try just to expand your palate a little bit, because it's a little bit more crisp and floral, and definitely not sweet like we've been trained to associate Riesling with. So just to wrap this up, I'm not telling you this because you need to memorize every region or every grape, but when you try a wine and you really like it, these are the things that you want to look for, because then when you want to repeat that, maybe you go to a wine store and they don't have that specific wine that you really enjoyed, you can kind of piece together a suitable alternative based off of what you know about that wine. So if you really enjoyed, a Pinot Noir from Oregon, you might know that you would be down to try a red Burgundy. So just kind of knowing some of those associations is a really good way to make sure that you are picking a wine bottle well, and also expanding your tastes and expanding your experiences with wine without having to go in completely blind. So if you know that you're going to enjoy a specific grape varietal, maybe you start off with just learning a little bit more about Pinot Noir, and then figuring out which regions you like Pinot Noir coming from. They grow it in France, they grow it in the US, they grow it all over the place. And that's just a good way to start on a wine journey without having to go all in way too fast. Before you go, if you have any wines that you've been curious about or that you want to learn more about, let me know in the comments. And if you're interested too, I can go into a deeper dive about like label decoding and helping you understand whether or not you're likely to enjoy a bottle of wine that you're getting at, any type of retailer. So if that's something that would be interesting to you, let me know in the comments, and I'll be happy to put together a more in-depth video on something like that. Thank you for joining me. I hope you have a great day. Cheers.